I'm Tricky Pixie with the Windy City Rollers, and welcome to Roller Derby Rules Series Class 2. Today we will be going over positions, lead jammer, and star passes. As a reminder, this is what we've covered so far in Class 1. Today we will be going over Section 2.2. Here is the link to the rulebook. We will be going over this section here. I will also be taking a look at some of the casebook examples. Definitely check out the casebook if you're confused about any of the rules in particular. Some of this should be familiar, but going over positioning. So for each jam, each team must field one jammer and 1 to 4 blockers. One of those blockers may be a pivot, but does not have to be. But each team must field one blocker who is not currently serving a penalty. So basically, they must have at least one blocker on the track at the start of a jam. Skaters who are serving penalties count towards position limits. So if you have a jammer in the box, you cannot field a jammer on the track. When the jam starting whistle sounds, you want to be completely on the track and you want to be legally positioned. These are two separate things. Legally positioned is where on the track you are, but being completely on the track is physically being within the track boundary lines. For jammers, being legally positioned means you are touching or behind the jammer line. For pivots, it is touching or behind the pivot line and in front of the jammer line. All non-pivot blockers must be behind the pivot line and in front of the jammer line. If a pivot is touching the pivot line, all non-pivot blockers must also be behind that pivot's hips, regardless of which team they're on. At the jam starting whistle, if you are not completely on the track, you cannot participate in that jam. You will be asked to return to the bench. If, as a result of not being on the track, a team does not field the minimum amount of skaters, such as not fielding any jammers, their team will receive a penalty, and that penalty will be given to the captain. If you are wholly illegally positioned at the jam starting whistle, you will be penalized. This includes if a jammer is completely in front of the jam line, if a blocker is completely in front of the pivot line, or if a blocker is completely behind the jam line. If you are partially illegally positioned at the jam starting whistle, you will receive a false start warning. A false start is where the referee will not blow the whistle, but will say color, number, false start. When you receive a false start, you must yield. Yielding is when you disengage and give up your position and allow anyone to pass you if they want. After a moment, you can return to gameplay. Being partially illegally positioned includes any blocker touching the jam line at the whistle and any jammer touching in front of the jammer line at the whistle. Some casebook highlights about positioning at the jam starting whistle. Straddling counts as being out of bounds, where straddling is defined as touching both in and out of bounds. The exception is if only one hand or arm is touching out of bounds, but the rest of you is in, then you are still considered in. So if you are straddling the line at the jam starting whistle, you are considered not completely on the track, and therefore you cannot participate in that jam. Second, if a pivot is touching the pivot line at the jam starting whistle, all non-pivot blockers must be behind that pivot's hips. If they are not, they will receive a false start and must yield. A failure to yield results in a penalty. If two pivots are fielded, for example, one in the box, one on the track, one of them will be informed to remove the stripe. If one of them is in the box, the one on the track will always be told to remove their stripe because the pivot in the penalty box is serving their penalty as a pivot and must finish serving their penalty in that position. So going into specific rules for the different positions, starting with jammers. They cannot be accelerating counterclockwise at the jam starting whistle. If they are, then that is a false start and they must yield. You can be moving when the jam starting whistle blows, but you cannot be accelerating. As for jammer abilities, they are the point scorer for their team. They are able to leave the engagement zone, which is the in-play area. We will define that more in the next video. And jammers are able to control the star, which is either wearing it on their helmet or holding it. But they are not allowed to hide the star by crumpling it up or putting it in their pocket. It must remain visible to the referees so they know who the jammer is. Rules about pivots. So at the start of the jam, the pivot may touch the pivot line as seen in that photo. Pivot's abilities, they may become the team's jammer if they receive a star pass, and they may control the star. So if the jammer drops the star or if the star falls off of the jammer's helmet, The pivot is able to pick up the star, give it back to the jammer, or move it around. Other blockers who are not the pivot are not allowed to do that. Only the pivot and the jammer can control the star. For those pivot abilities, they can only be used if they are actively wearing the stripe. So if the stripe falls off, they're not allowed to then receive a star pass or pick up or control the star. As for blockers, it just says all other skaters are considered blockers. You cannot have a helmet cover or any helmet markings that might be confused for the stripe or the star, just to be clear who is who. So going into lead jammer. The lead jammer is the first jammer who establishes superior position to the foremost in-play blocker, having already earned a pass on all blockers, excluding those ahead of the engagement zone. So that's a little bit of a mouthful, so we're going to break it down. So what is lead? The lead jammer can end the jam early by tapping their hips repeatedly. Otherwise, the jam would go the full duration of 2 minutes. Lead jammer can only be awarded at most once per jam. So once someone is declared lead, they remain lead for the rest of that jam unless they lose it. If they do lose it, no one else can get lead for the rest of that jam. When someone gets a lead, the referees will blow 2 short whistle blasts to indicate that, and the jam referee will be pointing at the lead jammer the entire time that they are lead. So now let's take a look at an example of getting lead. There were 2 criteria. First jammer to establish a superior position to the foremost in-play blocker. If let's say this blocker is out of play, they are like this. So if the red jammer comes up, once they pass the foremost in-play blocker, which basically means whichever blocker is furthest up, whichever one is most in the counterclockwise direction. Once they establish a superior position, which just means getting in front of, then criteria 1 is met, and it is the first jammer to do so. The second criteria is then they must have already earned a pass on all blockers, excluding those ahead of the engagement zone. So we won't worry too much about the engagement zone right now, but just note that this blocker is not in the engagement zone. That would be if they were here in play, but they are all the way out here. So we don't need to worry about them. So when the red jammer came up, they earned a pass on all blockers. We won't go too in depth on what earning a pass means in this video, but in general, 97% of the time, once you get past everyone, you have earned a pass on all blockers. So a quick example of when that might not be the case is if this blocker is in front of you, you get hit out, and then they get hit out, and then you step in front of them. You never passed them while you were in play, so you did not earn a pass on that blocker. But in general, I wouldn't worry too much about it now. Most of the time, if you get past everyone and you're the first jammer to do so, you are the lead jammer. So those are the 2 criteria: establishing superior position to the foremost in-play blocker and earning a pass on all blockers. Eligibility to gain lead. So you must meet these criteria in order to get lead. You must be wearing the star if a star is visible. You must not have taken off the star. If the star happens to fall off your helmet, then you can put it back on. You can still get lead. But if you intentionally take it off, then you can no longer get lead for that jam. And you cannot have received a penalty in the current jam. You can start in the penalty box and still get lead because you received a penalty in the last jam. A case where you might not get lead is if you leave the engagement zone without earning a pass on all blockers. So that's the example that I gave. So let's say that happens where the white jammer has not earned all of their passes. If at that point, white jammer leaves the engagement zone, they are not the lead jammer and they cannot become the lead jammer anymore. Once you leave that engagement zone, it is too late. You must earn and get lead on that initial pass. Lastly, if you receive a penalty or if you take the star off, then you lose lead jammer status if you had it. Alright, here are some casebook highlights for lead jammer. So if both jammers meet the criteria for lead, the foremost jammer is given lead. So here's what that would look like. If both jammers are in a position to get lead once they pass the white 3 blocker, if white 3 were to leave the engagement zone, then suddenly both of them would fulfill the requirements for lead. Because white jammer is the foremost jammer, white jammer would be given lead in that scenario. The next example is lead is given if the criteria are met, and the furthest blocker is out of the engagement zone, including being pushed out. Similar to the last one, if this blocker goes out of the engagement zone, they are out of play, red jammer is granted lead. And that includes if red jammer is pushing them once they're out of play, the red jammer is declared lead. Lastly, jammers must still earn passes on blockers who were in play, but a no pack was declared. If you're not familiar with the pack rules, this one will be a little more confusing. So here I have the pack skaters highlighted in green. In this case, if there is no pack because the blue 2 blocker skates forward, so you still have to earn a pass on this blocker to get lead in this case, even though there's no pack. Moving on to passing the star. A team's jammer may transfer their position to the team's pivot by successfully completing a legal star pass. The pivot does not become the jammer until a legal star pass is complete. And after that star pass, the jammer becomes a non-pivot blocker. The new jammer cannot gain lead. Once the star is removed, lead is lost if it was gained, and you're ineligible to gain lead anymore. The new jammer inherits the former jammer's laps, passes, and points. So what is a legal star pass? A legal star pass is when the jammer hands the star to their pivot, and both of them are upright, in bounds, in play, and not penalized. Contrastingly, an illegal star pass is when the jammer hands the star to a non-pivot, or the pivot is not wearing the stripe, or during the star pass, either the jammer or pivot are down, out of bounds, out of play, or penalized. If a non-pivot blocker receives the star pass, they will not be penalized as long as they immediately drop the star. If the jammer hands the star to their pivot while they are out of bounds, this is an unsuccessful pass, but they will not be penalized yet. The pivot is then warned they are not the jammer, but if the pivot puts the star on, then they are penalized. If the pivot stripe falls off and they receive a star pass, again this is unsuccessful but not a penalty, and the pivot is told to drop the star. So as we covered, the pivot is not able to use those pivot abilities unless they have an active stripe showing. If for some reason the jammer decides to throw the star at the pivot, this is an incomplete pass because a legal pass requires it to be a handoff hand to hand from jammer to pivot. This would be equivalent to retrieving the star on the floor so the pivot is allowed to catch it. They would probably hand it back to the jammer, so they are allowed to control the star as the pivot. If a non-pivot blocker unintentionally gains control of the star because it fell on them or stuck to the Velcro on their safety gear, for example, this is not a penalty. However, if that blocker were to pick up and handle and control the star, that would be a penalty. So that blocker, if they do grab the star, must immediately drop it because they are not the pivot or the jammer. Finally, if the star falls out of bounds, the jammer and pivot may skate out of bounds to recover the star. Alright, that's everything we had for Class 2 for Section 2.2 positions. If you have any questions, please leave a comment down below. The next class will be on 2.3, Engagement Zone Impact. It has no subsections, but it is a very complex and important section all on its own, so it deserves its own video. Alright, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thanks for watching. In an attempt to reach the track before the jam begins, red blocker jumps from out of bounds. The jam starting whistle blows while they are still airborne. Red blocker lands in bounds upright after the jam begins. Outcome: they should be ordered back to their bench and may not participate in the jam.